Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Reflections on Art. I'm really pleased to present this interview with Isis Rodriguez. I think this will be the last episode for some months because I'm currently working on my thesis for my Masters of Visual Art. So please enjoy, and I hope we'll be back very soon.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming today, Isis Rodriguez. It's a real pleasure finding out more about your art and your artist life. You seem to have lived a really interesting life and done some amazing paintings. So I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Like a lot of artists, your obsession with drawing started in childhood and you followed it through to art school, completing both a BFA and an MFA. Can you tell us a bit about your early experiences with art and how going to art school has informed your practice up to the present day?
Yes. Well, yeah, I've always been an artist. I mean, I knew from the time I was a child. I did start drawing at an early age, mostly copying cartoons, but the real meaning behind art was really at the church level, because I grew up with Catholicism. And so going to church on Sundays and walking into an architecture that just had everything was allegory, everything was mythology, and everything was meaningful from the way the architecture of the church was laid out in a cross. And then walking down the middle of going to a pew to sit down, you had, the 12 stations of the cross, 6 stained glass windows telling that story and 6 on the other side. And then you had, of course, your Bible, the for the Mass, and so and then going to catechism and reading, seeing my old catechism Bible, it was just full of paintings, not illustrations, full on paintings done in the great master style. And then to actually go to Europe and go to some place like the Santa Maria del Popolo Church and see 2 Caravaggios hanging like that, massive, that for artists to have even been given that role to tell the mythology to a whole congregation of people who were mostly illiterate at the time, to me, it was just absolutely fascinating. And to me, that was a huge task for artists to do back then.
Absolutely. It was quite a job. But it's interesting because I can see a lot of parallels to the work of Caravaggio in your own paintings and continuing on like that use of chiaroscuro and did I pronounce that correctly? I don't think I did. Chiaroscuro?
See, yes.
And allegory, but obviously talking more about pre-Hispanic mythology and figures, archetypes.
Yes. And how that kind of came about was, the other thing was art school introduced me to art history. And art history confirmed my Catholic upbringing, except that it showed me the timeline of how this culture created its mythology, and then this other culture came along and either conquered it or appropriated it, however fancy word you want to use to talk about that evolution of how just the history of Catholicism itself, how it evolved throughout history. Mm-hmm. So, and then growing up with the knowledge too, not only being confirmed through confirmation, literally, as a Catholic, and then going to an art school and getting confirmed that, wow, that history is truthful. And then learning from my grandmother and the whole Chicano cultural identity politics about the synchronization of Catholicism and the conquest onto indigenous peoples from the Americas and, in the Caribbean as well. And seeing how all those saints came about because those used to be goddesses and gods and divine entities for other cultures. So to me, that kind of evolution spoke very deeply to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a interesting story how that came about. I do have things I want to say about that too, but I would prefer to kind of get through some of the other questions before I ask you a bit more about this. Okay, so you're a very well-established artist. I noticed that your first solo show in 1997 was called My Life as a Comic Stripper. How did it feel being a young artist and getting attention from such art world luminaries as Judy Chicago at that stage in your career?
Well, Judy Chicago, I discovered her when I was at the San Francisco Art Institute, and I was introduced to classes like Women in Art, and her work was kind of toward the last chapter. There was actually a chapter called Sex Positive Feminism. And when I saw her work, it was very shocking. I mean, vagina plates, and I read all the criticism that she endured back then, which her work was criticized as being pornographic. And how could a woman do such a thing, And, but I didn't see it like that because I was the next generation, Generation X. And I saw it as I thought it was the most clever thing that a woman could ever do, or an artist could ever do, showing a vagina, because that is the essence of woman. That's where we give birth. I mean, how much more can you get? And so for me, it was a minimalist interpretation of what a woman was, very extremely conceptual. Mm-hmm. And then she takes all the plates and puts it in a triangle, which is the Trinity. That's a very religious symbol. And I use that kind of formatting a lot in my work. I use the triangular format as well, but with images, not with design. And then to actually go and see the dinner party in person was a very spiritual moment for me. And it was a female, divine spiritual moment.
I think the triangle, the downward pointing triangle, actually represents the feminine in tantric spirituality as well. So it is very clever in that it kind of draws upon a lot of different traditions of thought, and as you say, reconceptualizes it and makes it very minimal. I have to look at the dinner party. I have the book of it, but I've never seen it in person. So one day, hopefully.
Yeah, very amazing experience.
Yeah, I mean, art can be just such a transformative medium. And when you see a work that you really connect with, it's very powerful.
Yeah.
Looking at your art from the 1990s through to about 2006, you had quite a graphical pop art style. And you mentioned earlier that you actually used to copy the cartoon characters. So I'm guessing that kind of was an inspiration for you continuing on in your early art career. But then from 2007 onwards, you switched to painting with very classical techniques and effects such as chiaroscuro. What prompted this transformation in your work? Was there a major upheaval in your life that prompted this change in direction?
Well, I have to say, when I was in art school, I thought the cartoon was the new figurative. that's how I saw it. And I was actually painting cartoons as mythology. They were highly symbolic. Um, and that was kind of my mentality, that, you know, I was reading Joseph Campbell in those days. And so I was well aware of how mythology was universal and how we shared similar concepts and ideas.
Mhm.
So upon knowing all that, I actually, I was very excited about it. But the problem was, when I came out into the art world in the 90s, there was also a resurrection of pop art, you know, lowbrow movement, pop surrealism. There was graffiti artists, pop graffiti. I mean, and I just got lumped into that. And when I really did my investigation and research about what is pop art, and I began to read, you know, the manifesto, or the characteristics of pop art by Richard Hamilton, that he, there's an interview he did back in 1965 with a curator. Oh, I'm trying to remember the name of the curator. It'll come to me. It was Gene Swenson out of New York.
Mm-hmm.
You know, popular, transient, expendable, low cost, mass produced, young, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, big business. That's not what I thought I was doing at all. That was not, it was so superficial to me.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, why, you know, it takes a long time to do my art. I'm very thoughtful about it, very intellectual. I do a lot of research. Mm. And I don't consider my work throwaway or such a cheap piece of commodity like that. Mm. And there was just kind of an anti-intellectual movement in this new resurrection of pop art that just didn't jive with me at all. Mm. So in order to kind of, you know, rid myself of this label of it, I decided to change my style.
It's a very brave thing to do.
Yeah, especially in mid-career, after I've already emerged and got discovered, so to speak. Mm. And yeah, it really was.
Well, I hope it's paid off now.
I think so.
Yeah, no regrets.
Yeah, oh no. Oh no. No, absolutely not.
Very good. The two great themes of your work seem to be sexuality and spirituality. Can you tell us why you are attracted to those two themes and how they might be connected to each other?
Well, you know, besides my mother, one of the greatest influences in my life, whether I liked it or not, was the Virgin Mary. And I think, I mean, that to me is the most powerful archetype that has ever been created. You know, some people say India, there's Kali, life and death. You know, Mexico has a goddess of life and death as well. But the Virgin Mary goes, in my opinion, goes even further than that. It's about an immaculate conception. And she was young. Mm. And she was the perfect archetype to teach women morality, especially in a world that, as you and I have known, if just knowing our own history, how oppressive it was for women, and how that entire history, women had to be so careful. I mean, and then the weird thing about it is seeing the sexual, being birthed during the sexual revolution, growing up as, with contraceptives. Now we can look at sex not as procreation, but as pleasure. Just think of the duality in that alone. Mm. And then how that has affected other cultures. Birth control itself, the liberation of a woman's body like that. Whoa. And now, we're seeing as well a high rate of single motherhood in the United States, and also in certain poor communities in middle class, not poor, but poor and working class communities in Mexico. That's a very common woman now, a single mother, and some of them are doing it by choice.
Yeah. Well, I think,
and I'm not trying to be critical or anything.
No, but I think
back to the Virgin Mary as a single mother who actually was pregnant when she married Joseph, according to Scripture. There's paintings that show that in history. That kind of reflects on what's going on now. I'm not saying that it's the same meaning, but to me, these images of young women pregnant, having children without a father, is very striking to me.
Yeah. I guess one of the outcomes of like the feminist movement has been like changing the family structure. And I mean, I think that it's a great thing when it's a choice and, women can provide for their children. I think we've still got a long way for the social services, the social structures to catch up with this new sort of family structure. Because, I mean, definitely in your childhood, your generation, they're really like, this was very, very new thing, single parenthood. But I'm hoping that with time, it will become more like, children are raised in the village. Like, it's more than just like one or two parents. It's the whole community, because it takes a lot to raise children. I mean, I work with children and they need lots of different adults involved in their life. But I think you're right that the Virgin Mary is a very powerful archetype. I was actually raised atheist, so I don't know a lot about this stuff, but I do see it now that I live in Spain. I can see why she's such an important figure, why so many people gravitate to her figure in particular, because it is one of the few representations of the maternal divine, the divine feminine in Western culture. Really the only one.
And probably one of the last which expressed vulnerability.
That too.
I mean, if you think about the archetypes, and let's just do a very stark contrast. Let's go really far back, and just the Venus of Willendorf, that little, what was it?
Clay figurine. She's made of clay. Yeah.
I mean, well, fertility, that was it. That was your role. That was procreation. And then the evolution to the Virgin Mary, a moral teacher. There's some kind of intellectual dialogue going on with the feminine back then. And yeah, we are moving into a modern society. But even more what interests me most, and what I see myself doing more of, is how can we have relationships that are long lasting?
Yes, this is a question I ask myself as well.
I mean, because, being a single mother or just being a single woman can be very difficult. And being a single man as well. I mean, it's much, in the relationships I've been in, there was almost a happiness of, oh, good, we get to build a life together. And there was an excitement in that. And there was a kind of everybody contributing, and there was possibilities. And, I think if whatever community that comes out of this, there has to be like new ways of communicating, because, this polarization, the world is very polarized. And you can't say, you got to be you're walking on eggshells talking to people these days. And so to me, I think part of the reason why there's a lot of single motherhood, single stuff going on is because there's kind of a lack of ability to communicate. And then the word that I come up with is, it's not a very nice, well, a lot of people don't like it, but a sense of compromise. And with compromise, or maybe not even compromise, but giving, there has to be, I give to you, you give to me. And there's kind of a sense of appreciation for the different sexes, appreciation just for living. What I see is kind of lacking, but been lacking for a long time. And some of that comes out of a lack of meaning in life. I mean, I've gone through it myself. I mean, believe me, when I went to the artist residency at the Couturier to start the Masked Women series, I was like this. I was losing my inspiration as an artist because I felt like I had pushed sexuality and sex pot as far as it could go. And I'm an aging woman, so here I am going through perimenopause, and sex isn't really that important. I've made a decision not to have children. Being an artist can be very difficult and hard on family, and especially children, because it's like this, you have to be, and then, the times haven't, you're right, supported a type of mentality for it to be okay for women to be, I hate to use this word, but selfish, or really focused in a career. And I think it's almost impossible for women to put so much, that's almost too much stress on somebody. I mean, men are grown up, and they're taught to, here's your career, you need to be a provider, but they're not, and that they go to work, create the money or whatever. That used to be the old, I don't know. In Mexico, that still holds true, by the way. This is not the okay. Other countries, the man is still seen as a provider. And now a woman has to be a provider and raise a child. I almost think that's an impossible task. I mean, that itself creates some kind of archetype. In fact, I'm in the process of making an archetype about that whole difficulty, that conundrum of women thinking.
Yeah, it is very difficult. And I guess on the flip side, men haven't really been raised to think about families. And I mean, I think part of the reason why, they're not so involved anymore with child rearing in terms of being part of the family structure, and why some women are choosing to have children on their own. Like, it's very hard to find a male partner who's willing to agree to voluntarily be part of a family project. Not the simplest thing in the world. So I can see why some women go ahead and do it on their own. I think that, it's a lot for women, and I think it's a lot for creative women, because, as you say, we have to be very focused. Some of us have paid work, and then we do our creative work outside of our paid work, and then where would we have time for relationships, for children?
Well, the biggest thing that I noticed, the difference is women don't like competition. Unless you decided to do sports in high school, and then you went off and became a professional sports work, but a lot of women I talk to are not competitive. The first thing that comes out of their mouth is not talking about networking and talking about when they're going to nail the next job and how much they made last year. And that doesn't enter the conversation of most women that I know, even the most successful ones that are working in wherever corporation or famous artists they are. That is not the first thing that comes out of their mouth. And there's just a whole different mentality between men and women. And I don't know. I think there's just different values altogether. And I don't know if that's easy. I don't know how you're going to change that even throughout millions of years. I mean, still women have put family first or put their bodies and health first. And I don't know how much of that's in the DNA, how much of that we might have to just kind of be at peace with and not make it some kind of bad thing or some kind of.
No, I don't think
No.
that these sort of values should be considered a bad thing. I think that the society and the economy needs to change to account for the fact that there are people who have different priorities other than being on top. And so hopefully we're moving towards that world, but we'll see.
Yeah, totally.
All right. The masked woman is a reoccurring archetype in your paintings from 2007 onwards. Who is she and what does she tell us about contemporary Mexican society?
Well, that woman has gotten me into so much trouble, let me tell you. First, my name is Isis Rodriguez, and then a mask. So a lot of people associate my name with terrorism, which, you know, I was ISIS way before the terrorism thing started. And, but yeah, I had done quite a bit of studying about that mask and what it meant, what it means. And back in the days, you know, it was the new mask of conflict. And the people that made it famous, Subcomandante Marcos and the Chiapas, the indigenous people of Chiapas, that mask specifically symbolized their conflict, which is over resources and territory. Well, I just think women embody kind of the same thing, because if you're a single mother, resources and territory is everything. You're trying to find stability, you're trying to get a roof over your head, and you're trying to take care of your kids. To me, that's survival mode right there.
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, I think shame, my own personal cross to bear. And, you know, I did find the source, as I've often said, you know, from Adam and Eve, and then, you know, going into the Virgin Mary, and then women are carry the burden of beauty and sexuality. We're the ones responsible, and we're the ones that condemned if we have a child. Not so much now but in Mexico, it's still kind of an issue. You know, I used to remember my friends getting kicked out of their houses for getting pregnant, and they couldn't graduate from high school. They couldn't even go to high school. So the whole drama around sexual women and sexuality, and just that kind of burden of responsibility that maybe you're not ready for, and it's not well received when you are so young like that. So because we carry that burden of beauty and sexuality, for me, it seemed to me that that mask was the perfect mask to protest the shame. So there are archetypes protesting shame.
That's awesome. I think it's so important to have like a sort of a contrarian perspective in art that can move consciousness forward. I think that's a really important role for artists to, I guess, challenge like the status quo and see if we can move what people think. In your 2019 series, Perros Sagrados y sus Chamanes, a new masculine archetype appears in your paintings, the figure of the shaman, the healer. How did you meet him on your spiritual journey? And is he, as would be described in Jungian psychoanalysis, your animus?
Well, the truth of the matter is, My first introduction to shamans was through women. And let me just see how I'm going to say this. For me, my first limpia was with a woman, a curandero, when I was in Oaxaca. And I was driving my truck through from the United States I was moving to Mexico. And I got robbed in the mountains. And my boyfriend at the time was with me, and my Mexican boyfriend. And when we finally got to our destination, we met with his aunt, and she's indigenous Zapotec, and she immediately said, you guys are going for Olympia, and took us to a village outside of Oaxaca de Juarez, a big city, and we had our Olympia done. And then I was doing, because I was at the residency, La Couturiera, the leather factory, I was already doing quite a bit of research on spirituality and indigenous spirituality specifically. And I'd known about Maria Sabina, which it's unusual for women to be shamans. And then there's a whole hierarchy in that world of healing, and in first world healing, you've got shamans, you've got brujas, you've got curanderos. I mean, those people are very well educated in their way of operating. So, but I purposely did a male shaman, and I have to say that the reason why was because I think it's really important for women to, because we are moving into a very woman-centric and mentality right now, especially during the pandemic. But before that, we have the Harvey Weinstein incident and the Me Too movement. And I think women have kind of this mistrust around men. And I thought it would be a really good idea to create an archetype that could be trustworthy and could create enter a different dialogue, a different narrative about men and what their role could be.
I think that's a really positive way of looking at it. I think a lot of men are a bit confused about their masculinity these days. And so I think it's quite helpful actually for them as well to have a different positive archetype, one that's based more around healing and caring than competition and beating up the other guy, this kind of thing. Because we definitely need to be moving beyond that kind of thinking.
Well, sure. You know what's shocking about it all?
What?
Is that we have archetypes already that do that. I mean, that's who Jesus Christ is.
Mm.
I mean, was he a fighter? His role was never in the military. He was a carpenter, a humble carpenter.
Mm.
And then he was persecuted and tortured and then crucified and resurrected. We've always had that kind of man in society.
Yeah, I guess it's in terms of like,
or an archetype.
Who does our contemporary society value these days? Like, I mean, as someone who was raised atheist, like Jesus doesn't really come to mind in my archetypal vocabulary that much. I more have drawn from like what I've seen in my popular culture. What did I grow up seeing on children's TV, for example? What, Transformers? So yeah, I mean, it's true that there's always been the figure of the male healer, but what do people get exposed to in the world these days? I think people spend a lot more time with Netflix than they do with the Bible, to be honest.
And I maybe you have a point right there, because I would think of other religions, Muslim,
Mm,
Buddhism,
mm,
Hinduism,
mm.
trying to think of it. And a lot of their, like, I think they were male. Is Buddha a male?
Yeah, Buddha's male.
And I think but you're right. If we're not really engaging with religion at all, and we're engaging instead with social media, then there's something to be, that's a whole nother podcast, isn't it?
It's a whole other podcast.
And let me say
afraid.
something about that. Let me say something. I have something very interesting to say about that.
Okay, go ahead.
If in the United States, the type of history that happened to Native Americans in the United States is a lot different than what happened in Mexico.
Yes, this is true.
The indigenous had empires in Mexico. They were well-established deities, belief systems, all that. And it was very hard for the Spaniards to come in and say, okay, we're going to transform you guys right now to believe the way we want you to believe. It was much easier to do a synchronicity and just change the names. Okay, well, Tonantzin, this corn goddess over here at the Hella Tepeyac in Mexico City, let's just have a celebration of the Virgin Mary there.
Mm.
And
this is how the Virgen de Guadalupe came about. Is this correct? Because when I went to the village of Guadalupe in Spain, it was really interesting because the way that Europeans painted the Virgin of Guadalupe before the discovery of the Americas was very different to how she's depicted in Mexican culture, because they had artworks from Mexico and they had artworks from Spain, and how she appears is very, very different. And I'm like, what's going on here? Isn't this the same version?
it is. And you're absolutely right. And isn't it, it's not, it is no coincidence that corn goddess happens to be celebrated around the time that the Virgin Mary is conceiving, her conception, all that those are, when I read The Power of Myth, that was specifically talking about how goddess and how different parts of the world celebrate a goddess or some kind of deity during the harvest or during that time of year. For me, it's just no coincidence. I think it's a universal thing. But going back to what I was talking about, the biggest difference between the United States and Mexico when it comes to how religion and how our being to mythology, the reason why the United States is so secular is because there were more nomadic tribes there. They weren't established civilizations like in Mexico. Not only that, but the indigenous suffered not one conquest, several. The first one by the Spaniards, because they went up north, the first one was devastating. We had diseases knocking, completely devouring them. And then you had settlers now coming in from Europe. So here's what happened. And it was very, it wasn't just Catholicism. We had Protestant, we had other religions that were very, very strict. And it completely, almost, I wouldn't say completely, but almost obliterated the belief systems of Native Americans. So there's no real, evidence left. There are no pyramids in the United States to show us what their mythology was. There's no codices. So what replaced the mythology was Superman, Batman, and European storytelling, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney, social media. That was the earliest social media. So that's very secular, and it's based on morals, but very secular. There's no connection to the earth. There's no connection. So it doesn't surprise me that people have a really hard time reading my artwork or really having a deep connection with it, because there is no original mythology in the United States. You go to the Southwest and you see the Hopi and the Navajo, or maybe you go up north and you go to Shoshones and you'll see some of that there. But it's been so appropriated that it's become so superficial that people like, well, is that really that Hopi figurine done by Native American, or is it done by some, European American, or
Yeah.
But that kind of mentality and process didn't occur in Mexico. In Mexico, there are legends everywhere. In the artwork, there so many artists are dealing with legends. That's very common. And it's
even with artists that moved to Mexico later in their lives, such as Remedios Barro and Leonora Carrington, explored these themes.
Yeah.
So is this part of the reason why you moved to Mexico? Because you actually grew up in the States.
I did. And I have to say, and it was, when you do an artist residency and then you get enlightened like that, and you have a good 6 months to really go deep, and things just start falling into place and making sense. That was like, okay, this is a huge shift. And it's a huge shift because I realized, wow, I felt like I found myself completely. I have to be honest with you, as soon as I started to see how I was just free of identity politics and just getting away from the personal being political, which is what I grew up with in art school. That was a very feminist thing. That it was just so liberating to not have to take sides anymore, to just say, you know what? And to find out that is the spiritual. You don't take sides. You take your side. Not because you're selfish, but because it's authentic and true. And that everything is political and active and and I have to defend myself. I was a leftist radical for many years, warrior. I wore it like a badge being from San Francisco. I'm not saying people shouldn't do that. Keep doing it. But not all of us are born on this planet to be warriors, to be social justice warriors. Maybe for us, the real war is inside of us. And that is exactly what's going on right now. How is it possible? We've all been on Facebook. We all been on and said one little thing, and it set off a whole craziness of attacks. And we've all been shamed and attacked on social media for saying something just we thought was okay to say. So that kind of shaming, that kind of judgment, and these are from people that if you ever met them in person, they're probably the nicest people in the world, or maybe they're your own family, and they probably didn't mean it, but it was just, oh my goodness. So that kind of emotional turmoil and chaos, I think, is directly attached to a loss of meaning. And so you have to take a side to find meaning. I have to take a side, I have to be an activist to motivate me to be an artist. And it was such a great relief to go to an art residency and realize I don't have to do that anymore. I can take my military uniform, that's why when guys come back from war, people come back, they take off the uniform. That's a symbolic change. I no longer have to do that anymore. And it's okay for people to do that.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was able to do that.
Yeah. I think you can only be a warrior for so long in your life. I know I've been a full-time activist as well. And, after some years, some of us get to the point where we need to start a different journey. As you say, take off the uniform and look inwards. But I really admire the people who can keep going, because it's so important. There's so many important battles that are needed to be fought. Obviously, at the moment, we're in the middle of, environmental crisis. We're starting to see real change in the way that, race and gender politics is being discussed, and those battles can only be won with boots on the ground. But as you say, not everybody can be a warrior. And I think probably part of the reason maybe why there's such a focus on art being political these days is because of the secularization of the society. We don't really know how to go deep, like what you said you did with the residency in Mexico. There's just not those experiences available for most people in the West, and even a lot of people in the East and other parts of the world. And I guess it's also a part of the intellectualization of art too. But in a way, like, art is a fundamentally emotional and spiritual creative work. I mean, I remember my first experiences of art were Buddhist art, and I'd used to sit and copy drawings of all the bodhisattvas and different figurines from Asian religions, because I was just fascinated by them. And yeah, I think there's a spiritual power to art, and it's a very hard thing for artists to cultivate that without, as you say, going dark and going deep.
Well, it's scary. I mean, I've lost a lot of friends over my art. And not because it's just that for them, it's hard to, that's just the way it is when you're doing art that talks about important or very deep, scary issues. Every one of us has some kind of dual, we all have problems in the past, and the ancestral and generational trauma. Who wants to bring that up? So I think in order for you, if you want, I'm not saying everybody should do what I do for, because, when you go deep like that and spiritual, it's going to surprise you what you end up finding. And it may not be what you want or what you thought it was. So for me, it's just better to be surprised and be completely blind and then find the truth, instead of having these expectations of what we think spirituality is. I don't know. It's the expectations, I think, that are kind of killing it for a lot of people.
I think expectations around art are very hard to meet. Definitely, I struggle to meet my own expectations most of the time.
Take it easy on that.
All right, let's talk about your latest exhibition, Crush. It just ended last month. What prompted you to make a series of paintings based on the world of online dating? And how does seeking love and romance connect with being a spiritual seeker? For example, Robert A. Johnson noted in We that the experience of romantic love, especially when ill-fated, can prompt us to explore more spiritual dimensions of reality that had previously been hidden from us. How did the experience of online dating deepen your spiritual quest? What was the outcome? We want the gossip.
Ay, ay, ay. Well, the word crush. I have a crush on you, or I'm just crushed by what happened, or I'm crushing it, There's it's a very multi-dimensional word, it has dual meaning. And and I think we kind of tend to, love has become such a cliche. It just is. And when you reach a certain age, what I call the over 40 and frisky, there's you've been through a lot already. Either had your kids, been through several jobs, been disappointed, and now you're a little bit more cautious about what you want out of a person. What's going to be the next chapter in your life? And the funny thing about it was that word over 40 and frisky, I remember using that word when I was 16 years old, trying to sneak into a bar or a nightclub and getting in and going, wow, look at all these 40 and friskies, and feeling like such an adult and dancing with them and feeling like, that I was a mature woman or something, and establishing myself in that hierarchy. And then, of course, when I became over 40 and frisky, I was like, oh, obviously my mentality had changed completely. And in terms of what you were asking about, how we can explore the more spiritual dimensions, especially after we've been wronged or disappointed. That was something that I had yet to accept. The whole idea of online dating seemed to me was a very millennial concept. And I'm a Generation X, so I had to do a lot of research. I was online on YouTube channels checking out people like Matthew Hussey and who's the other? There's this woman, and she's up in those. What's her name? Sarah something. In any case, they gave great advice how to do a profile and what to say to attract. And then you had to think about, okay, what kind of person you want to attract? What is just the top 3 things that are most important to you? So my profile went something like this. I'm an artist that likes to paint women in lingerie and military uniforms. When I post my masked women online, I get 5-star generals from Baghdad that want to friend me. So look out. I'm a dangerous and wanted woman. Oh my God. And it was shocking because I was like, I got like over 100 likes or hearts or whatever it was in like less than 8 hours. And I was all excited. I'm like, oh my God. Yay, those guys were right. Those coaches were right. But then trying to get a date was a whole different thing because half those profiles were fake anyways. And but I ended up getting 3 really good dates. They were men that were really happy in what they were doing. We celebrated life to the fullest. It was a good thing. The problem was they were so entrenched into their work, and they lived far away from me, and it was not sustainable, But despite that fact, it was such a great experience. And what I got out of it in terms of a spiritual quest was that love in itself is, you have to be able to get along. And you have to know how to pick your battles carefully. You have to be, is this really worth it in terms of, do I want to bring this up? Do I want to talk about this? Is what he said really that offensive to me? Again, just having the human skills to be able to accept somebody for what they are and to understand that maybe not everything they say or do is that big a deal, to that, and that whatever my next chapter in life is going to be, there has to be a certain level of acceptance, because he's never going to be perfect. Neither am I. And how to even avoid entering those kind of narratives. So for me, it was really important for me to be able, if I'm heterosexual, to understand the heterosexual man and just don't bust his balls so hard. Just let him exist the way he is, and that he's going to let me exist the way I am. And the 3 men I went out with were very much about that. And so for me, it was almost, I got all excited. I was like, oh my God, wouldn't it be nice to build another life, the end of my chapter life, the chapter that I'm going to grow old with this person. And now we come to the table with so much knowledge and wisdom that now whatever we talk about goes beyond. And so this ideal that love is a battlefield, or the conflict of love, now is pure perception. And now you really have to start talking about what unconditional love is and really understand and apply it.
Very difficult thing to do, and one that I imagine takes a long time in learning. Yeah, but it sounds like you had some good experiences come out of it and you learned some stuff. I know, being a millennial who online dates occasionally, I always learn things every time I dip in. A lot to learn still, for sure. All right, last question. In your paintings, you use a lot of symbols drawn from pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican culture. How has Mesoamerican culture and traditions influenced you in your art and life, especially as a woman of mixed heritage growing up in the US and then moving to Mexico as an adult?
Well, I have to go back to, there I would have to talk about, my grandmother, my Mexican grandmother, who was the one that would tell me the story of Juan Diego and the Guadalupe. I mean, she was literally born on the day of that vision of Guadalupe that Diego had when he was crossing over the hill in Tepeyac. So these are ancient legends that have been spoken through generations, passed on through generations in Mexico by way of Mexican culture. And of course, I've always been drawn to Native American and first world cultures anyways. From a child, I was always fascinated by the colors and the feathers and what all that meant. And the idea of the supernatural and the metaphysical. I would think that once I've been, this residency wasn't the first time that I went to Mexico. I've been going there for quite some time, many times visiting, trying to get in touch with my roots. I mean, the first time I went, I came out empty-handed. And I thought, I don't have anything in common with these people. I was born in the States. Why am I trying to make this an issue? But throughout time, my grandparents and their belief systems, and even my mom, who's Puerto Rican, they have a belief system as well. Growing up Catholic, all those things foster faith. And in order to really incorporate symbols and mythology in your art, I have to come to the table with faith, you know? And then, of course, when I went to Mexico, just everybody was into alternative medicine, was practicing it. Everybody had Olympia. Everybody, my grandmother would bless me right before I left her house, before I left on some journey. That's a common thing. So people are believers. Mexico is a culture of believers, whether it's love, whether it's football, whether it's religion, it's a culture of believers.
Wow, it's so different from, I've never been to the US, but Australia is somewhat culturally similar to the US in a lot of ways. And for me, a culture of believers is very hard to conceptualize. I mean, I'm a bit closer to it now that I live in Spain, but still, it's a very hard thing to imagine without having gone to Mexico myself, and what a contrast that would be from the US.
Yeah.
Wow, Isis, we've talked for like an hour. We're going to end the interview here. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the Reflections of Art podcast this month, and very excited to put this online. And yeah, I hope to see more of your work online soon, and definitely there will be links to your website from the blog post attached to this podcast.
Awesome. Do I have permission to share your link with
some of course
other friends that are online?
I would love that.
Awesome.